form an imposition by her husband or her father or patriarchy more generally, and she is shouted down, and when I say shouted down, I use the words advisedly, not by men, but by women who essentially claim that once the rhetoric is sort of filtered out, that she's a victim of false consciousness. In other words, she thinks that she's making her own choices, but her thought that she's making her own choices is just the best symptom of how deeply oppressed she is, because she no longer needs sort of physical restraint in order to veil. She does it of her own free will, where her free will is entirely controlled. So this has been very troubling to me, because it's just humanly very troubling to see these kinds of scenes. They're very hurtful to the women who are the victims of them, but they raise interesting and complicated issues, which are perhaps more interesting and complicated than the particular instances which I have been a witness of would lead us to believe. Because the fact is that it would be difficult to deny that false consciousness in a lot of contexts doesn't exist. Indeed, it is a theme of a lot of left-wing thought of the last 100 or 150 years. So just to give you some examples, it's certainly a theme within Marxism that the reason that the working class doesn't rise against unjust conditions of production is because they come to internalize the conditions of their own oppression. That's why you need a vanguard of the proletariat. Not a very popular theme these days, but it has been a theme in the history of thought, that you need a particularly enlightened and educated vanguard of the working class in order to see clearly what the mechanisms are that they are being oppressed by. Marxism may not be the flavor of the day these days, but think of post-colonial theory. Think of the roots of post-colonial theory in writings of someone like Frantz Fanon in Black Skin, White Mask, or in The Wretched of the Earth, who says very clearly that one of the biggest problems with colonialism is not the violence, although the violence is clearly a problem, but the internalization of the picture of the colonial subject that the colonial ruler successfully, through education, through humiliation, through all kinds of practices, instills in the colonial subject. And it is a theme of feminism as well, you know, which has traditionally been trained perhaps not on the Muslim woman, but in a lot of North American or Western feminist theory on the housewife who gladly accepts her role as a homemaker and does not look beyond the home as a place of potential flourishing for her. So the point that I want to make is that on the micro level, although, well, the opening point, the problem that I want to pose is that although at the human level, at the micro level, these scenes have been very very disturbing, very powerful, and I'm quite convinced in the particular cases that I have witnessed wrong-headed. In other words, what we had in front of us were not women who had internalized norms of oppression, but indeed full agents who were making their own decisions for themselves. I think that political philosophers such as myself, legal philosophers, can't just brush the issue of false consciousness off the table, because it is clearly a problem that a lot of progressive thought has wrestled with, and it would be a case of special pleading, I think, just to say that in this case it isn't a problem at all. So just to set a little bit of conceptual terrain, I want to make a distinction between two things that are often conflated. One is called, people often talk about the problem of adaptive preferences, right? Adaptive preferences. So the idea is that you claim to prefer something, you claim to want something, but the reason that you want it is you're just adapting to a context, right? So adaptive preferences in general are a healthy rather than an unhealthy aspect of human agency, right? If you move to Canada or to Quebec from some warm country, and you don't start having preferences amongst winter sports, you will be unhappy. You know, so if you just sit in your house complaining about how cold it is and wishing that you could play cricket or beach volleyball, then you will be unhappy. If you start developing preferences among skiing and skating and luging, then this is a healthy thing. This is adapting to an environment rather than keeping one's own environment, as it were, with oneself as a constant. Adaptive preferences give way to false consciousness when the adaptation is an adaptation to something to which one ought not to have to adapt, right? So in the case, the sort of silly case that I started off with, adapting to new meteorological conditions is not an injustice, although some people would probably claim that this winter in Montreal verged on the unjust. Basically, false consciousness arises when one believes that the choices that one has are good choices for oneself, whereas in fact what has happened is one has adapted to circumstances to which one ought not to have adapted. So there's a difference between just empirical, factual differences in circumstances to which one adapts, and a set of circumstances, a set of options, a set of choices that one affirms, but which one ought not to affirm because they are in some way or other unjust. Now, a big problem for political philosophy and for thinking about the way the state ought to adapt to this kind of problem is at what point can one say of a set of circumstances that, oh no, this is really a problem. The fact that a person has constrained her horizons in this way, that she sees these choices as adequate for her, this is something about which we ought to do something. So we could go from one extreme to another. At one extreme, I don't know if some of you have read the absolutely gripping and terrifying novel from 2 or 3 years ago called Room by Emma Donoghue, which is about a woman who is captured by a man who makes her his basically sex servant. She has a child by him, and they are imprisoned in essentially a garden shed for a number of years. And in order to make a life of seeming normalcy for the child, she creates a kind of world for him within the garden shed where they can choose to do this rather than that on any given morning. Clearly, a horrendous situation, and one in which even if the child and the woman to some degree are reconciled to the choices that they have to make, one wants to say that there's something horribly, monstrously wrong here that the state ought to intervene in. And here, the answer to what the state ought to do is fairly clear. It should enforce its laws against, forcible confinement and rape and things like that. There's sort of there's an easy case here. At the other end of the spectrum is people who make choices in a completely unfettered way. Free agents that are often represented in political philosophy who wake up in the morning and make decisions with complete limitlessness and boundlessness. So the problem is that person doesn't exist, right? The idea that we have agents who make decisions when they wake up in the morning about what they'll do that day, or decisions about their lives that are completely unconstrained, that is a philosopher's fabrication. We all make our choices within constraints, and unfortunately for the question that I'm posing for us, most of us find ourselves somewhere in the mushy middle between the two extremes that I've just pointed out. The extreme of the woman who has to create a life for her child despite the fact that she's being forcibly constrained, and the completely free agent. We all find ourselves somewhere in the mushy middle, and the question is whether there are lines in that mushy middle. If I used PowerPoint, which I don't, there'd be something with a line somewhere in a mushy middle. So just imagine it for yourself. The question is whether there are any relevant lines that can be drawn about places where we want to say, this is not only constrained choice, this is unjustly constrained choice about which the state should do something. So that's the first question. Where is that line? Is there a line somewhere between those two extremes? Are there different lines that we might want to draw where we want to say, this is constrained, but it's okay, versus this is constrained and it's not okay? And the second question is, if we can, define the sets of constraints about which we say that they're not okay, they're somehow unjust, they impose unjust constraints upon the individual, what can the state do about them? Okay? That's the second question. Now, I think that a lot of the charter debate has been based upon a reflex which not just academics, but politicians, pundits, often sort of are led towards a sort of simplistic view about the palette of actions that are available to the state. And the reaction or the reflex is basically the following one: if this is bad, it ought to be banned. Right? So the way in which the state paradigmatically intervenes is by banning something that we don't like. So we suspect, to use the instant case here, that veils are a mark of the oppression of women, and we suspect that a lot of women are wearing them not because they freely choose to do so, but because they are somehow victims of false consciousness. What is the best way to act for the state? Well, easy. You ban it. Right? Or you ban it in a certain range of contexts, such as the ones that were proposed by the government, public institutions, according to some definition or other. Now, I think that things are a lot more complicated than that, and what I want to do in the rest of my talk is to think a little bit, more about the reaction of the state to this problem of false consciousness, on the assumption that false consciousness does in fact exist, that it is a phenomenon about which we have to worry, a phenomenon that probably impacts subaltern people within or people who are dominated within a society more than white males like myself, and in particular, immigrant women perhaps being amongst the most potentially dominated women. Although I have to hasten to add, dominated both by the state and perhaps by, in certain cases, groups to which they might belong. So I place myself personally as a political philosopher, as a legal philosopher by training, within what is usually referred to broadly as the liberal tradition, right? The liberal tradition, which includes such thinkers as John Stuart Mill and Immanuel Kant. And the idea of the liberal tradition is basically twofold. First of all, that the responsibility of the state is before anything else a responsibility towards individuals rather than towards groups. The role of the state is to ensure or to make as good a case as it can to ensure that individuals have the wherewithal with which to lead flourishing lives. And the other liberal principle is a principle of limited government, which is often enshrined or represented by a principle that John Stuart Mill came up with called the harm principle. In other words, if there's no harm, there's no foul. That's not exactly John Stuart Mill's words, but they are essentially words to that effect. Your liberty stops at the point at which it affects the interests of others, and where there is essentially self-regarding action, where what you do harms only yourself, or where you do affects only yourself in an important way, the state just butts out, even if it thinks that, even if the majority, even if the government thinks that the way in which you use your liberty is not an optimal one. You could be doing something better with your time than what you do. So you have the harm principle and you have the principle of individual flourishing. So these two principles lead to a bit of a problem. So in particular, the harm principle. One implication of the harm principle, which is very interesting and kind of difficult for liberals when they realize that the problem of false consciousness is a real problem, is that the worry is that liberals will be deaf or blind to the forms of power that are in a way the most thoroughgoing. So what do I mean by that? If a man forces a woman coercively through violent acts to dress in a certain way, well, the liberal state, the harm principle of John Stuart Mill says, there's something you can't do. You have committed an assault or a battery. And so you cannot coerce a person bodily to do things that they don't want to do. So the state can see, as it were, the liberal state can see coercive actions that are, as it were, the result of physical constraints, say, right? If the phenomenon of self-consciousness, false consciousness, is real, and if it does in fact affect people, it might be one that the liberal state has trouble seeing, right? So if the definition of false consciousness is, I am so oppressed that I have internalized the norms of my oppression, I have internalized the picture of me that my oppressor has sort of expressed towards me, then physical coercion is no longer needed for my oppressor to control my actions, right? I will just, as in the case of the way in which the feminist women in the example that I started the talk with accused Muslim women of doing, I will simply do, apparently freely, that which my oppressor wants me to do. Which looks like for all the world like a free action, one towards which the state ought not to intervene. Right? So the paradox of liberal government, the paradox of liberal theory, the paradox of liberal practice is it risks being most blind and deaf and therefore impotent in the cases of the most thoroughgoing kinds of power. Right? Because after all, it is a much more thoroughgoing kind of power that need not wield physical force. If I can get someone to do my will without having to exercise any physical force, I have really come to control that person, as opposed to the case in which I do need to threaten force. And that would be an unwelcome result for a liberal state, to say, if Physical force is required. We're there. We're going to prevent it. We have criminal laws. We have laws against battery. We have laws against all these things. But if it is a use of force, or of power rather, that is invisible because it is internalized, then the million harm principle steps in and we're not going to do anything. So I think that that's an unwelcome result. And I want to just say in the last few minutes that I have a few things in order to try to dilute it a little bit, right? In order to see what paths liberal theorists and liberal practitioners of state can take in order to both take seriously the problem of false consciousness, or the potential of the problem of false consciousness that I defined earlier. So the first thing to note is that liberal theory, as I said before, and liberal practice is about individual agency, right? It is about creating conditions, social, economic, political, that will allow all citizens, all individuals within the state to flourish according to their own conceptions of what flourishing means. So the first thing to say, and this is sort of a banal truth, but banal truths are sometimes good to rehearse, is that banning, right, the very sort of instinctive reaction that people have towards things they don't like, it's bad, therefore the state ought to ban it, do not in any way facilitate people's agency, right? So to tell a veiled woman on the assumption, and I'm making the assumption here for the sake of argument, that she really is a victim of false consciousness, that by the way, from now on you can't wear the veil in context A, B, or C in public arenas, or if you're in Europe, in certain countries, in the street at all, right? It's not a way of liberating her. It's a way of creating in her the sense that she is no longer able to live according to the dictates of her conscience, right? So it is not an exercise in liberation of anybody. In a way, the assumption that people who accuse Muslim women of being victims of false consciousness is in contradiction with banning. Because if you're saying that these women are victims of false consciousness, what you're saying is that when you prohibit them from wearing the veil in certain contexts, you will create in them not liberation, but rather the sense that now the state is telling me that I can't act according to the dictates of my conscience, which is in no way, shape, or form something that will abet agency. The second idea that I want to put forward is that one of the conditions which will allow people to exercise agency, to live their lives according to their conceptions, is to have a wide range of options, right? Is to have a wide range of options. Again, something that might seem banal, where a wide range of options means two things. It means at least being aware that there are a lot of options out there that I might be able to exercise. And it also means seeing them as psychologically available to me, right? So it's one thing for me to know that there are people out there who are doctors and nurses and lawyers and what have you. It's another thing to say, this is a possibility for me. This is something that I could aspire to, right? And another thing about banning is that it, to the extent that my first assumption is right, that women who are told that they can't veil if they want to enter certain public spaces will just not enter those spaces, right? Is that we are prohibiting them or preventing them from accessing options, right? From being in public contexts in which they can form the consciousness over time that these might be options for them. So there is a very strong liberal presumption, I would say, against, even if one assumes that there's something going on in certain kinds of veiling practices that is redolent to false consciousness, even if one makes that assumption for the sake of argument, there's something about the banning option that just doesn't work on its own terms, as it were. The second thing, and maybe I'll end with this so that we can get some questions, is that, you know, another trait of I think liberal state, and it is one that underpins a view that has been talked about and thoroughly misunderstood, I think, by a lot of the protagonists in the debate of the last few months in Quebec. One of the things that's talked about a lot is state neutrality. The state ought to be neutral amongst various conceptions of the good life, as we call them, amongst various ways that people have come up with in order to organize their lives in a way that they see fit or in accordance with their values. So one of the justifications for state neutrality is what I would call epistemic humility, right? The idea that the state is in no position to adjudicate amongst the various choices that people make about how to organize their lives. The state recognizes its cultural partiality. It is made of people, it is staffed by people who are not kind of expressions of rational, of reason with a capital R, as perhaps a certain French Republican tradition might sometimes be tempted to think. They are culturally constituted persons who are in an epistemically weak position to judge the conceptions of the good that others might have. So there might be a tendency, given our cultural partiality, when we try to delineate conceptions of the good that are acceptable from ones that are not, to yield a good number of false positives, right? If I'm not careful and if I don't practice epistemic humility, if I'm an agent of the state, I may be tempted to look at something that doesn't look particularly kosher to me and say, you know what, that's just not on, we have to ban this here. Conscious of the fact that that judgment may be an emanation not of rationality with a capital R, but rather my own cultural partiality, we impose upon the state the constraint of neutrality, where neutrality is grounded in a sense that there's a good chance that when the state sort of gets into this kind of terrain, it will get things wrong, right? The result of that is that I think there is a tendency within liberal theory to having to when you have to choose, and you have to choose in a lot of aspects of life, false positives rather than false negatives. Do I want a regulatory practice in place that will generate a lot of false negatives, a lot of false positives? In this case, a lot of places in which I'm going to ban people from doing certain things that I have no business banning because they are in fact, upon reflection, not wrong at all, right? Or do we want to generate false negatives, cases in which the state will be tolerant of practices which are actually perhaps problematic, such as ones in which false consciousness is at issue. So I think that there's a tendency within the liberal state to, because you can't have everything, tolerate a greater number of false negatives than false positives. And I think that, and I'll end with this because I'm probably coming to the end of my 10 minutes, I think the two ideas, the idea that you're promoting agency and the idea that you're going to tolerate more false negatives, come together in a rather intuitively plausible way, which is that if you place oppressed people, oppressed women, who are in fact victims of self-consciousness, in a context in which they can sort of take part in the broader life of their society, the chances that they will, to use the wonderful Québécois word that often gets used in these contexts, cheminer themselves from where they are to a place in which perhaps they will derive greater self-consciousness and perhaps greater self-criticism about the norms of their own practices, well, the probability that that will happen is greater if you privilege a tolerant attitude, therefore an attitude that might give rise to a greater number of false negatives than if you go for the more Republican model that will tend to give rise to more false positives. So I'll stop there. I don't know if there'll be any questions now, but I'll be happy to take part in the debate later after the talks. Thank you very much.